much as it as you were responsible, be at peace with all men. Basically, if they've made conflict with you, that's just how it is. But as far as you go, you try to be at peace with all men. And then, of course, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Yes. Yes. It's knowing that I can't do it. I can't get there on my own. I can't provide for myself. I need God. And they're the ones that are going to make it. Good. Anything else on the Beatitudes before we move on to the next section? I know you could probably spend a whole semester on it, but okay. So as chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount is kind of broken down, you have the Beatitudes and probably this next section with the salt and the light. That's the first 16 verses. That is really the introduction to who a kingdom person should be. If you want to be part of the kingdom, this is who you need to be. And then you have the verses 17 through 20, which is kind of the introduction to what he talks about through the rest of the sermon about law, and he came to fulfill law, and that he is not trying to abolish the law or the prophets, but he's trying to fulfill it and hold to a greater standard than what has been before. And then what you see is 6 statements, which is, you've heard it said, thus and so, but I say it to you, thus and so. And so you have those 6 statements that carry through the rest of chapter 5. And then you'll have about 6, depending on how you count them, around 6 more different areas. Giving, prayer, fasting, laying up treasure, anxiety, judging others, and seeking God. And then you have, that goes through chapter 7, verse 11, and then you have a few more final instructions to round out the sermon. So that's kind of how I've broken it down. So verses 13 through 16, talking about the salt and light. Why does he pick those 2 analogies? Salt. You must be the salt of the world. You must be the light of the world. Why does he pick those 2 analogies? What is he trying to get across to his audience? Yes. Salt was very important to him. Yes. And it's very easy to see. Light, if it was dark out and all these lights were off and I put up my phone, there was light, all eyes would be drawn to it. Everybody would see it. And kind of what he says with the light portion is, you are the light of the world. The city on the hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to the whole house. So he's saying basically, you need to be this kind of person, what we just talked about in the Beatitudes. And that kind of person is not someone who just hides, and so no one sees him, and you're not kind of this person out in public, but you shine forth. If you're this kind of person, everything we talked about in the Beatitudes, you're going to shine forth. And in the same way, you're going to be salty, and you're going to bring salt and flavor to the world, and people are going to see you and taste you, and you're going to be different. And if you are not part of the light and you're hidden under the basket and you're salt and that tasteless, then what good are you? If you are not all these things that the Beatitudes talk about, then what good are you? And you'll be cast aside onto the path where you're no good.
I think it's interesting, too. These different things that he's using like this are very effective, very potent. Like the example of light. You are a light set up on a hill, which cannot be hid. I mean, that's something that everybody can see everywhere. Salt the same way. You use a little bit of it, it works. Leaven the same way. It's just very powerful and active whenever it's in its environment. So it's just way of showing us how influential we can be.
Yes, very much so. Very much so. Anything else? Yes, very true. Anything else that you want to bring up in this section? Very true. Yeah. Yep. Unsalted potatoes is very different from salted potatoes. You can tell. That's true. There's nothing like right. Yes. Very true. No substitute for light, no substitute for dark. It's they're very unique. And the same way, to your point, a person of this kingdom is going to be very unique. There's not going to be anything like it. Just like the kingdom, there's nothing like it. Every other kingdom, it's built on power, it's built on greed, it's built on I am stronger than you, so I'm going to dominate you. Everything opposite to what we just talked about in the Beatitudes. But this kingdom, these people are going to be unique. They're going to be special. Okay, we'll move on. If anybody doesn't have any more comments, we'll move on to the next section. Go for it.
We make the application to us as individuals. If we've lost our faith, what does that mean? It means that we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing in the environment that we're in. We are to have influence. So whenever we're around people, they should know that we're Christians.
Yes.
So make that parallel. They should know that we're Christians. I've heard of stories of people living next door to each other, not even knowing they were religious.
Yes.
We can't do that as Christians. This is a command not to be that way, not to be of that mindset. We are to influence people that we're around.
I remember a story. He was one of my mentors, Andy Cantrell, in Minnesota. He was he was working for a business in California. He did very well, and he was a very hard worker and everything that a Christian should be. He's very respectful and polite. And he decided he was going to go into preaching. And so he's in the elevator with one of the higher up honchos, and he turned to Andy and said, "So I hear you're leaving." And he said, "Yes, yes, sir. I'm going to preach the word." And the CEO or CFO or something turns to him and said, "I always knew you were a good guy, but I never knew you were a Christian." And then said that really struck with him because it's one thing to, if you are a good person and everybody sees you as a good person, who does that honor? It honors you. You have to also not only be a good person, but also give God glory. And that's what kind of sets a Christian apart. He doesn't just do these things for his own glory or for good karma. He does it to give glory to God. It's a light, but it's a light that reflects what we have in Christ. We would not have any of these. We would not be this type of person without Christ. Without Christ showing us how we should live. And so if we're not, even if we are this and we're not reflecting that and telling other people why we have this hope within us, then what good is that? So, good point. Good. Very good. Yes. Okay. Verse 17. Verse 17 through 20. He talks about. I wasn't going to spend a whole lot of time on this section, but he talks about how he's not come to abolish the law and prophets, but I have come not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Why would he have to say that? Why would he have, before he gets into everything he's about to talk about, why would he have to preface, before he gets to anything else, that I am not here to destroy the law and the prophets. Why would he have to do that? Because he's teaching something different. And many people who had been indoctrinated with the Pharisees would have thought, you're destroying the law and the prophets. And especially when he has the format, you've heard it was said, and we'll get to that, what that he's referring to. You know, he sounds like he's changing it, he's reforming it, he's making it different. But that's not what he's doing. He's come to fulfill them to a greater extent. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. It was, and that goes into Romans a lot. Of Romans, Paul talking about the purpose of the old law as a teacher or a tutor to bring us to the new law. Yes. Yeah. Right.
Revealing the mystery. He's showing the light.
And the Pharisees, which are the main ones that he's going against here, have kind of twisted that and made it what it was not supposed to. Especially when you get to the later ones with oaths and divorce. They've just totally twisted it into something the old law was not meant to be whatsoever. He didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it and make it what it was supposed to be in the first place. And really, that's just what both this last section and this section, this is what Israel was. They were supposed to be the light of the world. Israel, the nation, was supposed to be the light of the world. They were supposed to be salt of the earth. They were supposed to follow the laws that God set in place. But instead, they didn't follow the laws that were set in place, and they weren't a light to the world. And instead, everybody thought they kind of made God a laughingstock in many other times, because the prophets said that different nations would scorn him, say, you know, your God came to protect you. Why should I obey him? And then they would talk about the judgment that would come upon them. But they were not the light that they should be. Yes, Josh?
Jeremiah 31 only talks about
Yes. Yes.
Well, and I think you can see them struggling with that as they get into Acts chapter 18, trying to determine what to bind on the Gentiles as they become Christians. And then the elders and the apostles that were there discussing this, even after Peter rehashing his vision that he had, and how God told him 3 times, don't you call unclean what I've cleansed. Right. And that was a hard lesson for them to get and turn loose of the law. Jesus came to do something that men couldn't do. I mean, how many times did Peter and Paul both preach, why are you wanting to put people back under law? We nor our fathers could keep that law.
Right.
So why leave it? Especially even the Hebrews writer, as he was writing about that. You know, it's just not something we want to bind ourselves to, because there was only one that was meant to fulfill it, and that was Jesus.
Yes, 100%. And he also emphasizes, though, in this section that verse 19, therefore whoever relaxes one the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And then he says something that would have probably been knocked the socks off of the people in that day, verse 20. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And I've said this many times before, we think of the Pharisees as, you know, these evil guys. But in those days, they would have been thought of the most spiritual people around. Like, they were the most strict of anyone around. They had it down to a point which it almost looked ridiculous. But he says here, if your righteousness doesn't exceed them, then you're not making it, which would have just flabbergasted them. And then he goes on to detail why that is the case, and which that leads into the next, the rest of chapter 5. Before we get in there, anybody have anything else?
Just a question. Whenever whenever I've studied that, I've always felt that he's discussing attitude there more so than their ability to keep the law. Their attitude to want to make sure that they safeguarded the things that they did so that they could be pleasing to God was where they were in error. But the attitude with which they were doing it, I think, is what is pointed out there. Does anybody else see that? Or?
I agree. Yeah, it's one of those things that, yes, I think I agree that there needs to be attitude. We're not trying to get away with anything, and also on the other side, not trying to uphold what Jesus did or God didn't tell you to uphold, which was what the Pharisees did. Yeah, don't bind what he is not bound. Also, you're supposed to. I think there is teach the truth, and this is how you should live. Whether we cannot uphold it, I mean, we all can't, but that's the goal, that's the aim, that's what we're supposed to shoot for, no matter what. And many times, man in general has lowered that standard, lowered that bar, just like the Pharisees did, what we're about to talk about, lowered that bar to something that seems more attainable. And I think they've violated what he talks about here. If that makes sense. Bob? Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Totally changes how they think about it. Good. Okay. As we go into these final 6 things, these first 6 things that he talks about, anger, lust, divorce, oaths, retaliation, and loving your enemies, not hating your enemies. Of those 6 things, which do you think is the hardest for you? Hardest for you. In verses 21 through 47. So anger, lust, divorce, oaths, retaliation, and love of enemies. I have one that I think is hardest for almost anyone, but anger. Mine would be love of enemies in a lot of ways, because I think that's the hardest one on here of any of them. Because it's one thing not to do something, but to actively love someone that hates you or wants to do something against you, I think is just even a greater calling. And if you've had anyone that's treated you badly or has been very unkind to you, malicious intent, you probably know how hard it is. But each one of these is difficult, and I think probably each one of these we've struggled in one way or another. When it talks about anger, we'll go through these one at a time. And is the point that you should never get mad for whatever reason? Yes. Be angry, yet do not sin. Ephesians 6. Yeah. Yeah. So anger is an emotion. It's just like sadness and happiness and everything like that. It's what we do in our anger that's the sin, like you talked about.
The problem with anger for a lot of people is it just causes them to lose control.
Yeah.
It's almost like being not sober. I mean, we're commanded to be sober. And a lot of people let anger just drive them to do things that just they're not in the right mind.
And this kind of goes to the point I was going to make, is that if you are doing what he says to do in verses 1 through 11, the Beatitudes, the natural conclusion to that is what he teaches in 21 through chapter 7, basically, is that if you have the kind of person that you should be in the Beatitudes, you're not going to return evil for evil. You're going to have self-control in your life. You're going to have that type of attitude in your life so that you don't sin in your anger, if that makes sense to everyone. hmm I mean, Jesus was angry. Yeah. But I don't think he ever lost control. He's very calculated at what he did.
He had a reason to be angry, just as
Yes. Right. Because we make up causes like all the time that are not actually justified. Usually it's against me, and I think anger comes from its root is a lack of justice. You hit me, and so anger comes from that. That person did not get what he deserved, whether good or bad. He didn't get what he deserved. I'm angry about it. Even if it wasn't me, I'm still angry about it. So I think it comes from a lack of justice. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yep. Yes. 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 Yeah.
Anger can, we have to be very careful with anger, because anger can cause us to do a lot of things. I mean, look at Cain and Abel.
hmm
So it can lead to a lot of things. We have to be very careful about anger.
Very much so.
I suppose it's like James said, put the ear so to speak, so to anger.
Yeah.
But he goes on to say, anger cannot work like
Yes. Yeah, anger is a very destructive force, which it can be sometimes that's what is needed. Again, God was angry with the nations, and so he poured forth his justice on mankind. There's a time and place for that. But we have to think, why are we angry? Is it because we were violated, or we were disrespected, come from a selfish motive, or are we thinking about God and how things should be? As we move on, do the last ones in like the last 3 minutes. Lust and divorce. You can see how the Pharisees constantly changed the rules. With lust, they said as long as you don't commit adultery, you're fine. You can look, but don't touch. To put it in today's words. With divorce, they took a commandment that Moses God had given Moses out of context, and it was not what it was supposed to be. The divorce was basically so that they tell the woman you're divorced, and then turn around when she was married to another man and say, oh, you're committing adultery. It was to protect the woman in that instance. Instead, they took it as a way that they could just divorce for any reason whatsoever, no matter what, which was not what it was supposed to be. The same thing with the oaths. Certain things that you took oaths on or you swore by, that meant you either had to keep it or you didn't have to keep it, depending on what it was. And their yes wasn't yes, and their no wasn't no. And then they had a saying, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who's evil, but anyone slaps you on the right, turn to him the other also. So if the Pharisee said, if someone punches me, I can punch him back. That gives me the right. But Jesus said that's not how my people should be. And I don't think this means that you just let people, walk all over you. It says nothing about you can't move aside. It's you are not the kind of person that retaliates. You don't turn one sin into two sins kind of person. And I think that's the attitude that's coming here. There's definitely a precedent in the Bible that you are not to help someone else sin by not moving, by not changing, by making it easy for them to take advantage of you. So this isn't just let them walk all over you, but to not retaliate. And then finally, love your enemies. It says that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Again, probably one of the hardest commands that Jesus ever put forth. This idea that you have to love those who persecute you and hate you and do all kinds of things against you, which again tie back to what he talks about in the Beatitudes in verses 10 and 11 and 12. How you rejoice, how you're glad is you love your enemies and you love those who do bad things to you. So, anything in those sections that you want to make a comment about?
All of these things should in some way glorify God.
Yes. Yeah. And that kind of goes back to 1 Peter 3, in which he's talking about all these, and he's talking to people who were in persecution, and he's saying when people do things against you and bring up false accusations against you, you still show them why you're not angry about it, why you don't react in a way that they would expect you to be, and you show the hope that is within you. Good. Yes. Yes. Very good. So, thank you for coming here. I'm really glad that I could have a discussion. This is how Bible class should be. I really appreciate all the good comments. We'll do chapter 6 next time. The worksheets are in the back. Feel free to mark on those and whatever, answer those questions, and I'll probably ask them during the thing. But thank you a lot. you have your songbooks, you can turn to 679. 679. That'll be the song of encouragement in 1 second. I'll be reading from 1 Peter chapter 2, real quick. 1 Peter chapter 2, starting in verse 18. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when mindful to God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued to entrust himself to who judges justly. He himself bore our sins on the tree, that we may die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. We were studying Matthew chapter 5 and how he called us to be, who we should be as Christians, as people in the kingdom. But he's not calling us to do anything that he did not do himself. All through his life, in every area of his life, every point in time in his life, he was everything that he told us to be. In the Beatitudes, when he talks about anger, when he talks about hate, when he talks about love, when he talks about all these things that he talks about in Matthew 5 and really the whole gospel. And here in Peter, Peter kind of continues that. Right before this, he talks to being subject to every human institution. And then he talks about servants who, even though their master is ungodly and beats them for no good reason, even though they are doing their jobs appropriately, endure it. And be good spirits about it. Rejoice when everyone persecutes you and does all kind of manner of evil to you. And Peter gives the recommendation, you should do this because Jesus did this. He went through all manner of persecution. He also suffered, and he left us example. But I think the key thing that he says there is verse 21, for this you have been called because Christ also suffered for you, as leaving an example. And I don't think that just applies to servants. That applies to all of us. Whatever situation we're in, whatever part of life we're a part of, if we suffer, we take it in good standing. If we suffer because of COVID that's going around today, we take it and we rejoice. Even though we don't like it, even though we don't like going through it, and there may be heartaches and there may be times that people persecute you or say bad things about you, you go through it no matter what. And you still have that joy about you, like we've been talking about, we talked about in Philippians. And the reason that we should is because that's the kind of person Jesus was. He suffered, and he left us an example. And when he was threatened, when he was spit upon, and when he was beaten, and when he was flogged, and when he was mocked, and when he hanged on there on the cross for hours suffering, he didn't do anything out of anger. He didn't do anything out of jealousy or envy or anything bad. He hung there in love. That's the kind of people we need to be in our life. And so if you are here and you're not a Christian, this is not how you carried yourself. If you need the prayers of the church, you are a Christian, but you're not kind of this person in your life and you need help. We offer you the invitation to come forward and we can help you as we stand, as we sing.
It's so sweet to trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word, just to rest upon his promise, just to know thus said the Lord. Jesus, Jesus, how His cleansing blood, just in simple faith to bluntly knit the healing cleansing blood. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I prove Him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more. I'm so glad I learned to trust Him, precious Jesus, Savior, friend. And I know that Thou art with me, will be with me till the end. Jesus, Jesus, how I trust Him, how I prove Him more and more. Jesus, Jesus, precious Jesus, oh, for grace to trust Him more.
Just a minute, Brother Carl will lead us in closing prayer. I have a few announcements, some announcements from Sunday. We mentioned that Shirley Graham's niece and her husband, it's Clint and Sherry Murphy, have been tested positive for COVID, so let's remember that family in our prayers. Also, continue to remember Miss Shirley's Graham's niece, Kim Henthorne, who is suffering with brain cancer. She's been on our prayer list for a long time, so let's continue to remember her. I didn't speak to Elaine. How's Kathy doing? Is she okay? Okay. Right. So she has gone to the doctor and they're checking her out. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Right. It's nothing to wait on, that's for sure. So remember Kathy in your prayers. Reed had mentioned he wanted requesting prayers. He's getting he's not here tonight. He was getting checked, a 6 month check for his prostate cancer today, and hoping for positive results there. So let's remember him. Sharon Giffen is going to be getting some more CAT scans done soon. She's feeling a little bit better. Continue to remember Josh too, as he's on that kidney transplant list. Anybody else that we need to mention? Shirley's not feeling good? Okay. All right. Remember Shirley. And there's several that I guess have chosen not to come yet to our services. So, we'll reach out to them. But if anybody knows of anybody else that's not been here that maybe is sick, let us know, and we want to keep them in our prayers too. So this is our first Wednesday back, and I guess we'll start back on each Wednesday. It's a good crowd for the first one back, so it's good to see everybody. And then for Sunday, we're going to still do the 10 a.m. service only for this Sunday, and then the elders will make a judgment each week, I guess, to decide when we'll start bringing in the class service too. So remember that. Anything else from the elders mentioned? Okay, let's stand and we'll have our closing prayer.
Father, we come before you this time, thanking you for this opportunity that we've been able to get together and to open your word and to study it. And we're certainly thankful, Father, for the word that you preserved for us to help us to understand. Father, for Father, that you be with those that were mentioned. Father, that you help them to be encouraged, that we are thinking of them. Things that are being used to restore them successful. And we ask, Father, that you allow them to or whatever state they find themselves in, so that this life is temporary, and our goal is to ultimately look forward. Pray, Father, that you help us to face things in this life that can give cause of trouble and concern. Father, we ask